Hello?
Good morning.
Good morning. I guess just waiting for more people to show up.
Okay, how are you?
All right. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, how are you? And Jesse's there. Yeah. And did you want to post the link to the Notion, Jesse? I don't know if it's in the Slack, maybe. All right, here we go. So yeah, this is our Notion. Thank you. All right, so let's get started. So pretty good week, I guess, for people. We had our first GSOC meeting of the year, so on Fridays. And so anyone's welcome to attend that. We're basically doing our GSOC projects, but we're also doing this more general open source interest group. So we have our virtual reality for research project. We have our open source sustainability project. And then we have like more general open source interest. So if people are interested in learning about open source, or they have something to present, or they want to talk about something having to do with open source software, or even like open access publishing or something, then that would be the place to come. We also, Thursday, we had our second human use of human beings meeting, and that was pretty good. We had a pretty good discussion, pretty robust, on chapter 1 of that. That's the book by Norbert Weiner, and talking about cybernetics and a lot of allied areas in technology and philosophy. And so that's led by Amanda and Jesse and myself, and some other people are there. And then we didn't have a Cognition Futures meeting this week, but we did have a DivaWorm meeting. So
well, we actually did have a slight discussion, but it wasn't really a full. It wasn't like an actual meeting where we advanced anything outside of just talking about what was going on. But it wasn't. It was mostly just like project discussion for a little bit, which was useful. And more. I want to talk more about that. Projecting with you next time. Okay. But yeah, it was good. Things are there was maintaining a little bit of momentum. We know that's important from the discussion yesterday in Google Summer Code.
So I guess I'll give it a floor over for updates if people have them. Just things you're thinking about or things you want to bring up.
One thing that we talked about at the half Cognition Futures meeting was, so we spent a lot of time like setting up this framework that seems to, I think it like easily leads to specific projects, even if we haven't gone down any of those paths yet, except for what I've been working on with the embodied neurophenomenology. So by next week, I'd like to have more on that, because I think like one of the main takeaways from just our little project management discussion is that we're at a good place to start showing our interests by just like doing instead of just like explaining and adding to this conceptual framework. We can just like start writing on the particular topics that individual members of the group are finding interesting, and like showing by doing, or explaining our interests and what the project's about by just pursuing particular like sub projects or manifestations of that. So yeah, by the next meeting, I'd like to have more on that front.
Yeah, and I guess to follow up on that, it's a sense of we kind of gotten the necessary differentiation along kind of even just like the prescriptive versus descriptive stuff, and building out a little infrastructure there. And now it's sort of like now sort of basically make artifacts that are talking to those different points. And this stuff that we've been doing, I mean, we've kind of been building that up all along anyway. But I feel like it is sort of it wasn't like, obviously we didn't like have some breakthrough in the meeting. It's more like just acknowledging kind of our movement along the lines far enough and having kind of enough structure. Like, okay, there isn't really more structuring. It's kind of just more like, okay, let's the next step is, in terms of like our meeting structures are fine, but like the next step to advance the project is actually going to be more about, let's have these outputs come into existence and start, you gotta put down the puzzle piece to kind of start putting things adjacent to it. So that's
a good way to put it.
Yeah.
The puzzle piece approach. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Right, like each project will exemplify like bits and pieces of the larger goal.
Yeah. And it's like those analogies between like puzzle piece or like mosaic or like brush strokes, because it's not really, there's going to be some overlap,
Yeah.
But you kind of have to overlap at some points, and there's more rich just put it down there. So anyway, yeah, I have a bunch of like general updates to think about, but I'm curious. I know Hussein's here, so if you guys want to have like general stuff, I'll kind of say mine and launch into some like broader things.
Okay.
Let's get this here.
Did you have an update, Hussain?
No, I didn't have any updates. I just thought I would join to see what was going on.
All right. Welcome. Okay, Jesse.
Yeah. So Bradley kind of covered a bunch of it. I really like the human beings reading group. But wanted to read that book for a very long time, and the discussions that are coming from it are great. It is live streamed, which has been kind of a fun experiment with that. It's kind of nice because it's a lot. It's been a really fun experience for me in terms of some of the stuff I want to do later, in the sense of like, we talked about our oral discussion series, we talked about podcast adjacent stuff, but just things where discussions are recorded and put out, and it's so much easier. And there's a reason why like Cognition Futures meetings, the reading group meetings have been, the reading group also like project. I think it's more fair to say like project meetings at this point, because that's really what it is. It's hard to, I don't feel uneasy about putting them online. It's more, there's not really a lot of value, or it doesn't really make a lot of sense for me right now to do it in a way that feels good about it.
Yeah.
Whereas if we have a clear external thing that we can talk about and center, or like in the case of the book, or we've had many book series with book groups like Johan in the past and stuff like that, or external stuff with other people. I'm just sort of noticing the difference in that area. So it's been very informative that way for me, and I'm getting more and more sense of there's I think I said this to Amanda recently this week, or there's certain conversations I really want to have, and I'm really on a personal note, but also dovetails heavily in the lab, is that there are certain conversations that I think I really want to center and be inviting and document and record and make these sort of public-facing artifacts. I don't want to be a content creator. I don't want to make things that are a certain way, that I feel insubstantial to me. But I feel like having and sharing some conversations about Cognition Futures, about some of the mentoring stuff, about some of the product development stuff in particular, are really something that I'm trying to do more. So, and want to build out around. So the reading group right now is been a sort of a nice test ground for me in project management. Since that wise, it kind of blew up like that way, and I appreciate Amanda for sort of letting me experiment a little bit with that. So that's sort of one thing. But outside of like that, I don't know, agenda of mine for it, at like the reading group, I think is really, really great. We covered this chapter 1 had a bit to do with like some of the history and some of the I don't know if my Notion notes on this are going to be very good. I'm going to look at them really quickly. Yeah, I'll share my screen for like a couple seconds. Hey, Morgan.
What are you trying to open the? Oh, there we go. It's working.
I was trying to do a window thing, but I guess this will work.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's sort of past discussion, but it was a really interesting mix between a history of like physics with Gibbs and some things about like Einstein and Newton, and then chapter 2 kind of started going into I unintentionally read ahead because I was listening on an audio version while I was going forward, but there was this movement towards like getting some deeper philosophical backgrounds. That we saw these like, well, we had this conversation about wishing we had time, or at least I kind of imagine like how great it would have been to just like talk to Norbert directly about some of these views about like, oh, like how are you just like dovetailing between Newton and Leibniz and Fermat and Huygens and Gibbs, and then like and just it was a very fun exploration there. Talked about the medium as a message. We talked about I really liked Amanda had this comment about the ability of the medium to be constitutive of the message, and we kind of riffed upon that, and a very, very amazing image, a highly interesting image that I put together a long time ago, which is this quote from Norbert about like, brain and computer and the comparisons. Purpose of cybernetics was interesting to see play out here. We had a nice discussion about like some tweets and Maxim Lipinsky here too about the total shutdown of theoretic metaphors, control theoretic metaphors by philosophers. And, it was a really nice, a lot of fun tangents that are sort of being able to come together. And I think having that, even though it's sort of a nice offshoot from our normal discussions where all these threads can come together. So that was a really enjoyable, fun thing to be a part of. And I think it's serving to me as an example where having some kind of an external, something external, like nice, like I'm seeing the opportunity for very good discussions to come forward where something is external and people can focus on the external thing and relate some of their own personal theory building work or experiences around it. And I think that's not an unusual format for discussions or discussion series in general, but it's just kind of, it's sort of insightful for me I don't have a whole lot of experience with doing that while having very specific conversations I want to have in mind. So that was cool. And then I've been doing some project management work specifically for Cognition for the methods project. I'll kind of just very briefly show this just to kind of show the work.
Okay.
Like we're slowly building out more and more things here, particularly on this side of things. I've started putting together some of the glossary work. I'm revising this. This is a bit incomplete, but I'm getting there to this like actual set of questions that we can use. I will be building out sort of an active versus a potential project arena, and there's sort of a vision of being able to maybe not arena, but like, I don't know, a pool of potential projects. And this is kind of just updating from like the potential papers to write and active questions, and kind of merging these things, but taking out, okay, functionally, what do we need? Because we need questions that we can sort of tag or highlight, and then projects that are both like active, kind of what Amanda was saying earlier about like the puzzle piece stuff and putting it down, and then pools of things that we're kind of seeing, identifying, okay, it's not just a random loose idea, or not a complete twirly bird, if you will, but something that's fixed to a question or fixed to some other things. And that way, I'm thinking particularly like once fall happens, I'd really like to get a couple interns who are part of the vision is to be able to kind of make the project structure doable such that there's it'll be much easier to integrate into bringing people along into it to help out. So that's kind of a big part of the excitement too, is from that. And now it's sort of like, okay, we get to actually we get to focus on, okay, we have the embodied neurophenomenology project that Amanda is kind of, captain of that ship in some ways, and this was just the original title. And, we've had the talk and the paper and the experience at the Embodied Intelligence Workshop, and now Amanda sort of has a different view, and like that's great. And so kind of getting to a place where I want to get up to speed and continue to push forward on the project side of things, so I can support more fully Amanda's project, but also other projects that come along. Because other things in this sort of space will happen, and the more we have a coherent structure of like what's going on and how do we bring the project up to speed. And for those who know, I have a very strong not necessarily analogy, but a sort of experience. And it's when I was writing my first paper, I ended up being the first author on it, but I had a lot of support from my PI about here's how we want to situate all the background information and the structure of like the experiment or the theory that we're trying to do and move it forward. And I feel like basically, okay, we're kind of into that space theoretically, and like I want to have I want to get to a place where I can support others and do that kind of facilitation work where it's just that person putting the idea out and then moving it forward, and the dialogue there to support that. I don't really know what to call that entirely, but it's sort of getting to that space, which is exciting. So anyway, yeah, this is good. Cognition Futures is fun. The Human Discipline is good. on a personal-ish note, everybody's name wrong. Just thinking a lot about the summer and the fall. Like I will be doing some graduate stuff in the fall, and it's this big sense of it's May, but because it's May and because it's mid-May, that means it's basically June, and then June means okay, well July is about to be here, and then August is fall basically.
Yeah.
Like it's that like. There's time, and there's also like time is either expanded or compressed, and that's both of those things are true at the same time, in certain things, but also like the academic planning of your life, of my life anyway. It's that way. So, I'm really part of the thing about the conversations I want to have is about like, how as my availability and focus shifts. Like how do I have things in place that solidify the discussions I want to have in the future? So that's on my mind a lot. Not a lot to kind of dovetail into this a little bit. Not a whole lot. I mean, I submitted something to the competition. I don't really think there's a lot there. I don't think I'm going to win or anything, right. But it was useful for me to do the FQXI. The next major submission, I think, is going to be We Robot, which, I think this should be due sooner than that. I believe it's due like at the start of June, so we have a couple weeks. This is going to be my next general submission. Will be the We Robot poster submission. So it's here in Boston this year, which would be great. Neuromatch Academy applications have closed, but hopefully everybody who got to do that, who wanted to do it, could do it. I'm excited. I may pursue that this summer, the deep learning one. I never got to do that one, but it's kind of subject to other things. I think that's mostly it. There's a few other bits and pieces. I've enjoyed the Google Summer of Code discussions. Got something like that here too. Yeah, we had some decent. I don't know if we had a lot of solid notes here, but the discussion itself was really good. We have some different programs, or some. I think it'll be a good way for us to center some of our project management, project open source efforts, professional development, and some of the. It's kind of a way. I think it's kind of been a nice outlet, almost a primer in some of the discussion series I'd like to have. But it's been a nice outlet for Bradley and I to kind of start organizing ourselves for both the summer, but also like I think there's a lot of adjacent. Like you could take really congruent conversations from that and make the conversations we could be having in something called a discussion series that is recorded and put on specific blocks. And it's not to say that we'd be recycling material in a dismissive way, but more like I think it's becoming more and more clear to me. Like, okay, these are sort of the conversations, and these are the artifacts that we're either generating by talking to people, or that we're sort of I don't know. It's the same conversation, which is different facets. Like there's a conversation about what the lab's take on and what the lab is doing about project management, professional development. That is also that has a facet of, okay, well, here we are talking to Google Summer of Code interns. Here we are talking in the Saturday meeting. Here we are talking about it to a more general public, or a more there's different instances of it, but it's the same conversation. And I feel like that's becoming more clear to me, which is exciting, and also thinking about ways to what to do about that constructively. So that's good. I think that is most of my updates. So I will return the mic to Bradley, unless there's any other comments or questions about those things that I covered.
I don't think so. Thank you for the update. I don't think we have any other submissions that we need to worry about right now, do we? Let's look at them.
I've posted a few things here, and then oh yeah, actually there's one that's due today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't think anybody really saw or commented on this. I'm glad we kind of thought about that.
Oh, this one here. Okay, I saw this.
Yeah. Hyper Digital Designs, a small one-day conference. How technology can mediate human creativity, agency, and play. Welcome folks both to explore theoretical questions via the philosophy, ethics, and the theology of technology, as well as practical science for engineering, media, and communications. I'm going to submit something to this. I'm glad that I kind of remembered this thing in general.
Yeah.
It's a pretty, it's a small event that Jenny's sort of had, she met some people through Dizzy and some folks at like Oxford area or Cambridge, and but one of them's like heavy in like religion and theology, but they wanted to kind of put their efforts into this thing, and that's cool. But I'm going to submit something I think on like frontier map ish stuff.
Yeah.
Because part of where I'm going with frontier map is quite along the lines of, and Jenny doesn't really know. I mean, Jenny kind of knows about frontier map, but she didn't like reference that specifically for me in this way. But yeah. So I will be doing this. If people are interested in this, like reach out to me. It'll probably be something I just put. It's a very short abstract I'm going to put together today. But yeah. That's a thing. There's also the this is not loading. The Complex Systems Conference. I'm not really going to center that too much right now, but I just want to mention that it's on the radar. And also this last one about models of consciousness. I forget when there's I forget what their submission process is. This is at Oxford, so I don't know if it's virtual or not, but I wanted to look into that. I guess it's FQXI related. Yeah. Excuse me. And also, I wanted to mention. Oh, I didn't say that. Here, I'll mention one last thing, kind of related to all this stuff. And I thought about Inez. Where did it go? Where did she go? Yeah, I've been listening to. I don't know what I'm name is. The podcast called. What is the podcast called? I don't really know, but I've been listening to Inez Hippolito, and a really good discussion. I think it would be good for the Message Project. But she also founded something called like the International Science of Mind, Philosophy of Science of Mind group, or something like that. I never heard about it before, and it has a pretty. I can't pull up the website right now, but it has a pretty. I don't know. Interesting looking group of stuff, and in general, like Inez has a lot of amazing stuff, and I really enjoyed the podcast. I will find it after I'm not sharing my screen and put it in the chat or something, but I will find it and mention it because it was a very good. It's great to have people who take the philosophy seriously behind sort of cognitive science and phenomenology. And know how to talk about it, because she says some nice things like, oh, I didn't finish the podcast because I mentioned that thing, unfortunately, but like in the start, she kind of mentioned something like, the dominant technology of the time kind of inherently takes on how we talk. Like there's this relation between that and what people are doing in the quote unquote modern or contemporary sense about how they're talking about like cognitive stuff, and how she mentioned like, the mind is the machine, one like came out like an output of that for sort of like a computer, I suppose, was like Fodor. And I can't remember how she set that up, but then she's like, oh well, then if you want like the Bayesian brain stuff, and how these different things from different philosophical takes on like reductionism versus realism in those areas, and how like you're either calling the brain, you're saying the brain is, in part a Bayesian predictive processing device, or you're saying the brain is a computer to some extent, and how like this relationship between those ideas and culturally how they shift and change over time. That was a really interesting kind of part of her setting up and backgrounding to, her takes on like embodiment and how much embodiment, and what, is there embodiment that's compatible with Bayesian stuff or not? Is there, what would Merleau-Ponty say? So there's a lot of interesting questions there that I want to continue to explore. So between that podcast and like that international Society of Philosophy for Brain Science, I think that might have been what it's called. I'll post all those links in the chat soon.
Yeah.
Just kind of exploring what Inez has been up to a little more was exciting. That is my final general update for today.
That's great. Thank you. Especially that last part where we're talking about the podcast. I saw that I hadn't listened to it, so I didn't know what it was. But yeah, that was great. I like this idea of metaphors being timely, like depending on what you're doing at the time or the culture, where the culture is at the time. It really determines the metaphor you use. One example is, I think we had this discussion sort of informally a while back, that there's this notion of the brain as computer, and then people debate the hell out of it, and they say, well, it's a computer. It's like a computer, like a desktop computer. Oh no, it's like a more general computer. And then it's funny because maybe before the computer became ascendant, like maybe in the early 20th century, the metaphor for the brain was actually like a musical instrument,
right?
Like playing music. And so that's coming back into some vogue now, but that was the dominant metaphor then. So you have these metaphors that change with like the thing that is sort of in the culture. And then, if the brain doesn't work like anything that we have in terms of an artifact or concept, then we can't really describe it, apparently. I don't know. I mean, that's one of the things you have to think about is like, is metaphor driving our model, our theoretical model, or is it just something we can do independently? And maybe that's something that's better.
Yeah, and between this, and I want to also weave in the thread of, I don't know if it was in a Saturday meeting or in a Cognition Futures meeting, but Bradley, you really, I think it was your I don't know, sub discussion about, we had a really nice discussion. How do I say it? It was the discussion that was like, what actually pushes broader like theoretical conversations forward over time is people getting together and talking about them in a specific way at a specific time.
Yeah.
And I can't. The words are escaping me, but it was it fits with that. It's what we just said is sort of like adjacent to that conversation where like we're saying, okay, yeah, it's sort of what's the most accessible like analogy or like a a concrete thing that we know about is that metaphor driving the zeitgeist of the time or not. And we were talking about how, like the conversation I'm trying to reference has something to do with like, we were basically, there are better words, but all I'm remembering clearly right now is like, it's almost like certain conversations are totally dependent, like it's almost like a synergy around them, if you will, in the Shomero sense, but like there has to be the requisite, a requisite interest, but also ability and getting the people in the same room virtually otherwise to have it over time. And it's like, unless that happens, the conversation stops. Like there's not further pushing in that direction. But like the parts, the things that afford that over different time periods changes. And there were, I can't really figure out how to reference the conversation better, but maybe Bradley or Amanda might remember that. What I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just kind of like if you're having a discussion about some concept or theory, it depends on who's in the room at the time. So sometimes, if you have people of certain levels of expertise or from different sub areas, different experiences, it can affect, what comes out of that. You see that on Twitter constantly, like where people like have a little circle jerk on their topic, and then they like have if you come from a different perspective, there are glaring errors in that conversation, and so sometimes that gets pulled, it gets mentioned, sometimes it doesn't. Papers can be like that too, where you have a paper, you may talk to people before you publish the paper, and then there's this point where people, you try to have enough conversations, but sometimes you are in that sort of bubble of your own field, and so people from other fields or even subfields will have different perspectives on it, and so that's one of these things you try to avoid, but it's unavoidable in a lot of ways because we don't have like full coverage of expertise in the literature and so forth. So this is the this is the podcast.
It's the podcast. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I don't know if they have a full website or not. That was the easiest thing that came up. They have apparently a Substack and then the podcast, like Apple, Spotify, whatever. Yeah. So that was that, and there was some other thing I wanted to mention. But that's fine. Yeah. That's all. I'll let it be for that for now.
All right. Well, thank you for that discussion, going over those points. Did we?
I know we have some other people who joined.
Yeah.
I don't know if like Morgan or Vrushali or Raj want to give like updates or just say hello or whatever. We try to offer space to do that one at the start of the meeting, but whenever people show up, if they have things. Also, like people may not stay the whole time. That's fine. But if people do show up, we try to give them space when they are available. So, yeah. Hey everyone, nice to see you.
Yeah, Vrushali or Raj or Morgan, do you have any updates you'd like to share?
Actually, I just have the updates that I shared yesterday.
Yeah.
And sorry for joining late. I got stuck up sometimes.
Oh, no problem. Yeah. No problem. Yes, we had a meeting, or GSOC meeting yesterday. Raj and Vrushali and Jesse were there, and I was there as well. We talked a little bit about the community period for GSOC, which is, this period at the beginning of the program where you have to become sort of immersed in your organization and learn what they're doing. And so I think, so we, I think that we're coming along on that. It's just a lot, I gave them like a huge, one of these fire hose approaches to the introduction. So I just showed them a lot of resources, and if you want to go through those resources, they're you do it at your leisure. You don't have to go through every point, every part of the website or whatever, but just to get an appreciation for the organization, and when you're working on your projects, to think about like how those things fit in to the organization. there's also this issue of organizational culture, which, it's hard to pick up from like just telling people about it. You have to, this is why I think it's important that people are in the meeting. Thank you for joining us, Hussain. Yeah, and so Vrushali and Raj, I suggested that they write blog posts for their projects, weekly blog posts. So I think that Vrushali and Raj both posted blog posts in the Google Summer of Code channel. So let me share my screen here. So yeah, they let's see. Yeah, so Vrushali posted a blog post here. Virtual worlds bloom as reality fades into digital dreams. That's a nice topic, or a nice title. And so she's now talking about her acceptance into the program. Put a little poem together here, and then is kind of talking about the project. So this is nice. Yeah, this is nice. So this is your personal blog, Vrushali. I take it that's what that is. And then Raj has also, I think, posted a blog post up here. Yeah, on Hashnode and Medium. So he has his own Medium, and as well, and looks like he's got a nice introductory post here talking about the project. And then yeah, so that's great, and we should keep on with that. We should keep going weekly on that. And I would like to also post some of these on our Medium. So we have a Medium for the lab that we use for, different topics that we talk about. We have guest authors and things like that. I might just reblog whatever you've put on your blog if it's particular, maybe the introduction to each person. So I'll put that up, and then I'll share that with the rest of the group. So I think that would be good to have, both for like documentation of the project, being able to assess the project, and then also for these sorts of promotional aspects. Yeah, so thank you. And then, so that happened Friday. And then Morgan, I know we talked last week at last week's meeting about the Metascience meeting that went on this week. Did you get to attend that? I mean, I was going to go over it a little bit, but I don't know if you had anything to add to it. Okay, well, yeah, so if you have anything, you can jump in, but otherwise I'm going to talk about that next. So let me share my screen. All right. So this was a session that happened this week. Oops. Sorry, hit the wrong button. Okay, so let me. So let me share my screen. All right, let's see, where are we here? So this is the Metascience meeting. This happened this week, May 9th through 10th, Washington, D.C. And they're going to have the session recording soon. So what is Metascience? So Metascience is a field where they study the science of science, hence Metascience. This is a meeting that they've been having for several years. They have on different topics, and we'll go through some of what those are. And they try to have some outreach here. They had some social media discussions, and again, they're going to have the lectures online. And I think they have the lectures online from other years, past years. So I think some of those have been floating around our Slack. And so if you want to check that out, you can do that. So let's see. The featured speakers, we have people like Michael Nielsen, who we've talked about before, on Metascience entrepreneurship. Samin Vazir on reforming the research culture, Emily Sena on collaborative approaches to meta-analysis, and Pierre Azoulay on funder and government-focused policy. So these conferences are often a mix of policy and thinking about meta-science in different ways, research, reproducibility, integrity, and then things like meta-analysis, where you take a bunch of studies and you look at the overall trend of things, the overall effect size, and things like that. So you don't just take one paper, you might take 50 papers in a field. And so this is a way to study science, the science of science, basically. This is a testimonial, I guess. The Metascience conference was an entirely invigorating experience. I got to meet and hear from meta researchers and I have long followed. It inspired me to pursue ideas and methodologies I would not have considered otherwise. So and then they broke it up into different discussions, and of course the virtual symposia, which is going to be online, and then the panels, talks, and posters. And so let's see, let's go to the agenda. So the agenda is a collaborative approach to meta-science towards evidence-based strategies for improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in science. So there is the aspect of DEI in science, and you can study different strategies for that. Then we have standards for research standards. So, these are things like, different open standards, different data analysis standards, things like that. And there are things like code sharing and data sharing that's important. So, code sharing and data sharing are widely seen to be, opening up science or improving the integrity of the science. If you have to share your data or code, people can easily go through and review that and then evaluate that along with the study. And the idea is that people who do that are less likely to cheat or make mistakes because they know it's going to be part of the thing that's being out there in the world. So, you typically don't want to plagiarize your paper. You typically don't want to, make errors because that's your paper. But if that's the only window you have into the world, you may be more likely to make mistakes, say, in the things that are underneath your underlying your paper that aren't in the world. So, I'm not saying that this is common, but people might make a mistake in their data analysis or their code, and if they're not showing it off to the world, they might just kind of sweep it under the rug. And so there are different ways that being open about this and transparent can be good for science. There's this talk, the role of meta-science in the year of open science. This was a discussion. I'm not sure what I wasn't even aware that it was the year of open science, but apparently, this is okay. We've talked about this. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy has called for 2023 to be the year of open science, and we've talked about this in previous meetings where they've been trying to advocate for open science in a number of ways. It features actions to advance open and equitable research across the federal government. And so the NIH has issued a data management and sharing policy effective in January to promote the sharing of scientific data. So we talked about this NIH initiative, but this is part of a larger initiative of the Year of Open Science. And so they had a little panel about that. And there are other things like methodological topics and, things having to do with clinical trials. And then, of course, you have this issue of rewarding researchers and how, if you have a reward structure in place, you can promote different behaviors in the research community. So, are you promoting virtuous behaviors, or are you promoting cut through competition and other things like that? So that's that. And then, there are things like big team science where you have large teams that have to collaborate, and how do you manage that? There's the mega study approach to behavioral science, mega studies are these huge studies that have like a lot of data in them, or sometimes they are meta-analyses where they look at different papers and they just look at the overall effect. And those things need to be coordinated, so they really do require this meta-science aspect. There's also, in meta-science, there's a geographical diversity problem. So I assume this is like that most of the people doing meta-science are from the first world or the weird countries, as we've talked about, the Western countries, where you don't have full geographic diversity of everyone doing science. Let's see. So there's also reforming science institutions. Yes, this is all pretty good stuff. Mega studies versus meta studies came up in the Society for Neuroscience talk about the NIH's new DMS data management strategy. Yeah, that was meta and mega studies are important there too.
Yeah, it came up in the discussion about, like, and we kind of mentioned this a few different times, like at society stuff, Society for Stack Group and NICWIC, but just at a federal level, for health related or bio related data, there's big pushes about the new mandates for managing and potentially making your data shareable and stuff like that kind of feeds into this. So anytime that comes up, I try to mention it because I think that's something to keep in mind, especially for those especially if you're working in that field, but also if you're working adjacent to that field, or the change. The refrain I often quote is saying that the speaker is emphasizing strongly, graduate students will be on the front lines of these changes. So always being aware of how those things come together.
Yeah, I think it's important for young researchers especially to kind of pay attention to what's going on in metascience, because this is something that you in your formative years you get to understand science from this meta perspective. How do you do science? How do you make it better? Not just in your own field, thinking about your own problems, but how do you improve the process? And so that's I think that's a good sort of way to think about it, and definitely this area of metascience is a way to go there. Metascience is an interesting area because it's an area. First of all, we've done some work in the lab. We have a longstanding interest in that. It's not something we're currently really engaged with a lot, but we do have this undercurrent of metascience. I've done metascience myself. I've published some papers with colleagues on it. And I've been involved in programs where we have done different things with metascience. I think yesterday's meeting we talked about reproducibility for everyone. And that's one of those things where, it's basically a initiative where people have created different talks on different topics in metascience. And then it's totally mobile for people. So you can take the materials, they're open to use, and you can host a symposium at your home university and spread the word about these ideas. So, there are all sorts of things on reproducible data analysis, on meta-analysis, on other types of practices, creating figures, creating other things, methods, and all those things kind of come together. Yesterday we talked about digital notebooks, which are good transparent tools for sharing code and running code in a place where it's not dependent on your machine or dependent on where you are in if you understand the entire code base or whatever. All these things, you want to be able to standardize them and have them work for everyone when they're evaluating the research. So, this is something that we've dealt with in the lab. But there's also this issue of what is metascience. And that's kind of one of these things I noticed from these talks. It's not like a conventional field like physics or psychology, which even there, you don't really know what it's about necessarily because there are always new areas that come up. And but I mean, how would you describe meta science from looking at these talks? I would say, there are a number of different themes. You have, like research improvement or research standardization. You have, openness. You have, looking across fields, looking at different trends. You have different practice-based things. So I mean, there are a lot of things here, and it's kind of hard to define the field other than saying it's meta science of science or science about science. Other than that, it's pretty much open. Um, it's like there's a practice aspect and there's sort of an analytical aspect, maybe even a theoretical aspect. But um, I think it's interesting, though. Like I said, for up and coming researchers to pay attention to that and what's going on in that area. I don't know if Morgan had anything to add to that. Okay. Well, yeah, like we can talk more about it in the Slack. Like I said, the videos are coming out later, so if you want to catch some of those talks, I'll have videos on them. And if you're interested in doing meta or talking about meta science topics in the lab, we can talk about them. We don't have a devoted meeting to it, but we might spend some time on it in the open source meetings, the GSOC meetings. It's because I think it's an important thing to learn. We might spend more time in this meeting on them, but not today.
Yeah, I'm interested in meta science talks, and I think it's kind of related to to an extent cognition futures stuff in general, and some of that are philosophical. I really like that. Yes, the lab's focused on very open to discussion of meta science and sort of the centering of philosophy in general is an environment I appreciate a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Let me move on now. I know Vrushali was here and then she left, so I was going to talk about the VR stuff. So I have some VR things to talk about today. The first one of these is, so last week we talked about this interface strategy where someone had come up with a way to touch a key on a keyboard, but the keyboard was virtual, so you didn't get the haptic feedback that you would get from a normal keyboard. Especially, if you think about mechanical keyboards where you have these big keys and they clamp down and you really feel the feedback. You have these digital keys that you would press in a virtual world with a virtual finger, although you could kind of feel, you could see that it was being moved by a hand avatar. And we'll see what that looks like in a little bit. But that's, that was a thing. So the solution to that was to have this key swing back and forth on a hinge. So when you hit it, it would swing on a hinge. And you could see that there was, you had an effect on it. That it wasn't just this press that would, maybe generate a letter. And then there's something, I think, satisfying about seeing that there's an effect on the thing you're pushing as opposed to, or there's a force feedback aspect, even if it's visual. In any case, I think the perception action aspects of that are somewhat subtle, but it's important. So we talked about that last week. This week we're going to talk about a few things. These are MetaQuest design features. So this is from the MetaQuest metaverse area. So these are just things that like design features. So this is from The Verge. This is a technology magazine. Meta open sources multi-sensory AI model that combines 6 types of data. So this is actually for Meta Research. They do a lot of virtual reality research in addition to the AI research that they do. And they kind of, go between those things. So there's now this push to incorporate AI into VR, which is, always been there. There's always been a sort of an interface there, but now it's becoming more and more something people are paying attention to. So this talks about the new image bind model, which combines text, audio, visual, movement, thermal, and depth data. So this is just combining a bunch of different types of data into some multi-sensory database or even a percept. So you're taking in a lot of different data. And of course, in virtual reality, it depends on the sensors that you have. So, you have text. Text is easy to display in a computerized world. There's audio, there's visual. So those are all things we're used to. Then there's movement, which involves movement tracking, and that's a little harder. Thermal is a little bit harder still because it's this, you have to deliver a thermal sensation. You have to calibrate it to what someone thinks is hot or cold, and it has to be sort of reproducible across people. There was one time they had something called smell-o-vision. I think it was back. They tried this in the 50s or 60s where they tried to simulate smells, and it wasn't very successful. They didn't really go anywhere. But the idea being that you can simulate, even like in a television, if you're watching a show where they have, something like there's a car chase, you might want to smell the fumes of the engine or whatever, and that would be like a thing that would enhance your enjoyment of that environment. Now, it wasn't very successful because they weren't able to simulate it very well, but in any case, you have these other types of data that are sort of hard to do. I mean, we can do text, audio, and visual easily. Movement tracking, we know it's hard, but we can do it. We understand how it works. Thermal and depth data, those are a little bit different. And depth being actually, you'd think would be easy, but it's not so easy because you do have, first of all, we have differences in what depths are. Maybe, I guess it's just kind of hard to really kind of put into a common framework. In any case, this is only a research project, but shows how future AI models could also be able to generate multisensory content. So they announced this new open source AI model. The core concept of the research is linking together multiple types of data into a single multidimensional index or embedding space. So this is basically like in data analysis when you have 30 variables and you use some sort of principal component analysis to reduce it down to 2 or 3 variables. And the thinking is that when you do that, you have dimensions that are not linked to any one thing that you're measuring, but they're things that you can that's the variance that exists in all of those. And the idea is that you can identify spots, places in that space that give you, some indication of whether something has structure, whether it's working or whatever. And so AI image generators like DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, and Midjourney all rely on systems that link together text and images during the training stage. So these are what they're doing is drawing from what generative AI is doing with linking together text and images or other things like that. There are also some that link text to video or images to video. They look for patterns in the visual data while connecting that information to descriptions of the images. So in generative AI, you're using prompts to generate images. And so the idea would be that, you're taking text and you're linking it to some set of images. So when I say, show me a person with a funny hat, we'll have a bunch of different types of images, but they'll all have they're looking for this sort of pattern in the database. That's what enables these systems to generate pictures that follow users' text inputs. So that's generative AI. The same is true of many AI tools that generate video or audio in the same way. Meta says that its model ImageBind is the first to combine 6 types of data into this embedding space. The 6 types of data included in the model are visual, in the form of image and video, thermal, infrared images, text, audio, depth information, The most intriguing of all, movement readings generated by an inertial measuring unit, or IMU. So this is movement tracking, and a lot of times this is using inertial reference frames. So inertial reference frames or inertial measuring units are found in phones and smartwatches, where they are used for a range of tasks, from switching a phone from landscape to portrait to distinguishing different types of physical activity. So basically, it's where it's tracking the motion of something. And like in your cell phone, there are all sorts of sensors in your cell phone that can tell, like, they're GPS sensors, but there are also these motion sensors that can tell where the screen is. So if you rotate your phone to hold it on its side, you can get the image to shift on its side, and it knows this from sort of the inertia of the movement. So you move it, it can sense the movement to a certain position. It will then send a command that has it do something. So that's what inertial tracking is, and they use it in AR or in VR a lot to look at, like, to move stimuli as you're moving your head or you're moving your hands, and it tracks with, say, maybe your field of vision. So like you might have a logo in front of you, and that logo then moves as your head moves. So you move your head, you see the target over there, you move your head over here, the logo moves with your head. Or it doesn't move with your head, it moves in response to your head. So inertial tracking is something that is, a common technique, and you can use it to different effects. So in this case, what they're doing is this is the figure here, cross-modal retrieval. This is an example from all this different data that's being put together. So the audio is a sound of a train horn. Okay, so there's a train horn presented. Then you have the image and video stock, which is just a different image as a train. So basically the train horn prompts a train image, or some set of train images. Then those train images are two-dimensional. So we want to know something about that environment. We want to get some maybe depth to the scene. So we have like the railroad crossing at some point. We have the distance to the railroad crossing. We have the train's depth. So if you go down the train isn't just the head of the train, it's the entire body of the train. And so you can render those things in a virtual environment just from the image. So you have the audio prompt, the images are generated. Those images then have depth cues that can be pulled out. And so these are harder to do because you have to infer things from this image. And then there's a text that gets generated from this, or you could use this as a text prompt for the same sort of generative process. So the text would be like, a train pulls into a busy station. Wind blows as a train moves through a grassy landscape. People sip coffee in the dining car. These sorts of descriptors of this whole scene. So you can then enrich the scene by, kind of probing different aspects of this world. Then this is the embedding space arithmetic. You have the image plus the audio, and this is the retrieved image. So you have a pigeon, a motor revving, and then there's a potential image of someone riding through a flock of pigeons on their scooter. That's the embedding space, or retrieval from the embedding space. It's basically taking all these cues, putting them into a pot, and then saying what things are associated with what, and then we'll pull like a coherent image out of that. And then, as opposed to the embedding space, this is just the audio to image generation. So this is audio penguin calls, generated image of a penguin is just simple recognition. And so the idea is that future AI systems will be able to cross-reference this data in the same way that current AI systems do for text inputs. So this talks about just an example here. Think about a future VR device that not only generates audio and visual input, but also your environment and movement on a physical stage. You might ask it to emulate a long sea voyage, and it would not only place you on a ship with the noise of the waves in the background, but also the rocking of the deck under your feet and the cool breeze of the ocean air. So this is, this hasn't really been implemented yet, but this is the vision. Okay, thank you, Raj, for attending. So that's one of the things I want to talk about. The next thing is this hands-on menu. So last week we talked about menus where you can hit it with your finger, your virtual finger, and it gives feedback, gives like the feedback of the letter being pressed or the number being pressed, but it also gives you that feedback, that visual feedback that looks like force feedback where this key is swinging. And those are the kind of affordances, that you can build into a system where you don't necessarily have that haptic feedback that's like the real world. So this is the hands-on Quest menu direct touch interactions. This is by Scarred Ghost, who does a lot of writing on VR. Quest Runtime version 50 is brought with an interesting innovation. The ability to interact with the main menu by directly touching it with your fingers as if it were a tablet. But it isn't as cool as it seems from the videos. Read my review and you will discover it. So this is direct touch interactions. This is direct touch interface in the latest Quest OS. So this is like the MetaQuest environment where you have, you use your controllers here and you have the hands that are simulated. And there's also a mode where you can just have like hand manipulation, and depending on how much background light you have, it works well. But the point is that you can use different gestures with your hands or with the hand tracker, hand controller, and you can make these interactions. So before MetaQuest Runtime version 50, the only way of working with the Quest main menu was via ray casting. In other words, you used the controllers or the bare hands to cast a ray towards a menu item, as you see here. And then you pulled the trigger. So this controller, you pull the trigger, the ray would point to something, it would select it. Or I think in the hand tracking, you would put your hands out, you would pinch the object, you'd have to get the ray depth, but it was still a ray that was projecting to that object in the virtual world, and then you'd select it. You can poke buttons with your fingertip to activate them, and you can swipe your index finger on the menu canvas to scroll it. When the first videos about this new system popped up on social media, everyone was amazed. Interacting has never been so natural. So this direct touch interactions, I decided to go hands-on with the system to test if it was actually cool, and also to use not only to see. The first thing I did was activate direct touch. So this is direct touch here. This image, that's Giphy. Okay, this is the GIF. So this is the sort of the panel where you can scroll on the panel and touch things. You can see the color change in the object as you touch it. So you get that feedback. It's visual, but it's supposed to be haptic because you're hitting it with your finger, but you don't feel that, so you get the visual confirmation. And this is much different than ray casting because you're actually tapping things. The depth is maybe a little bit easier to control. Like you don't need to hit a certain depth vis-a-vis the ray. You have this, you can just kind of move your hand towards the panel and get that feedback. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with here. Let's start with the good side of it. It's very cool. Scrolling the screen just by swiping the finger on the rectangle of the menu as if it were a tablet, which we know how to use. And there's also haptic feedback on the tablet. So this is, something that you know how to use, but you don't necessarily get all the feedback that you would normally get. In any case, it's incredibly intuitive and oddly satisfying. So this suggests that there's something about this movement that's an affordance, maybe even in the absence of conventional feedback. So there's this aspect of like having affordances or having substitutions. As long as the main affordance is met, maybe that doesn't, the feedback can be substituted. We can substitute out visual feedback for haptic feedback and so forth. And pressing the buttons by just touching them with the fingertips is so natural. As soon as I started using a system, I wondered how I'd lived with using this before it. But I also started to feel more strain. Interactions with the controllers are not natural, but they are very easy to be performed. The arm is closer to the chest, and the hand should rotate a little to the point of the desired element, but just enough to make the pointer reach out to the right spot. It's quite comfortable. So, again, as long as you're keeping that movement comfortable with respect to the frame of your body, you're reaching out, but you're not having to strain, or you're not having to guess where exactly that depth is, then it's more comfortable in that way, then it's easier to use. And then it kind of goes through some of this demo. So interactions with the controllers are much more comfortable than the direct touch ones. But also if we consider hand tracking, the traditional point and click and point and swipe with bare hands is less tiresome, because again, you can keep your arm closer to your chest. Swiping with raycast just requires small wrist movements, while direct touch requires larger hand movements to physically move the canvas. It's like you actually needed to move the canvas with your real hand. So this is the difference between the raycasting approach and the direct manipulation. So direct touch it requires a different set of movements. And so, this is maybe good or bad depending on your environment or maybe your personal preference. The point here is that the direct touch and the raycast have different aspects, and maybe they use different affordances. So I think this is an interesting UI trick, or an interesting UI sort of differences in the UI. So, okay. So that's all I wanted to talk about with respect to that. Amanda said she had to go, and so did Raj. So thank you for attending. Amanda said there's something funny about virtual screens recreating devices in VR. Okay. So that's all I had to say about those two things. Do we have any questions or comments?
I like that you brought up affordances the way that you did. I think that's going to be something I'd like to look into more in the future as we go down that road. We're kind of continuously talking about that, but yeah. There's a few more things, but nothing easy to say right now.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, this is just kind of like going through things that are out there, and I don't know how they get imported into like what we're doing research wise. Hey, Vrushali, maybe this is something we explore more in our projects, but it's also just something to keep in mind for like the interaction design aspect of it. And so, and then there are other ways that like I think virtual environments allow for a new view on affordances as opposed to like doing maybe experiments with cognition futures type stuff that we've been talking about with we've been talking a lot about theory. We haven't really been talking about experiments. So the experiments, are usually like you set up an experiment where you use some sort of simulacrum of reality to mimic feedback versus no feedback. It's really kind of hard to wrap your head around sometimes how to set these kind of experiments up. In VR, you almost have this by default because you have the environment that's like this thing that isn't real, but it's also kind of real. And sometimes you can substitute out visual feedback for touch and touch for visual and other types of things. And in the first article, we talked about how you can actually build this from AI. You can build an environment where you give all these cues, or you can elicit all these cues or render them in a way with an immersive system. So that's something to think about more. Okay, so we're coming along here. Did we have anything else? Did we want to talk about any project management stuff or anything else?
Well, I mean, I should move my location there. Sorry for the background noise. If I could, but also I'm not necessarily going to dive into a bunch of stuff. I'm sure if you say something enough, it will trigger things for me to say, but I'm okay with not saying things right now, which is probably unusual for me, but yeah.
Okay.
Other than you want to discuss, I'm happy to discuss it. I don't have any to-go things.
All right. Okay, then we'll move on to some of the other things we had. So we talked about the Metascience conference, and we have this paper on reproducibility. This is an example of Metascience. So there are a lot of papers where you see analyses of different things in the scientific community and the scientific literature. One of those, of course, is our scientific metrics, where you have like H-index, where they measure your publication output, how many times it's been cited. So that's something that people try to game a lot of times. There's a benefit there of being promoted in your job, or having something you can advertise as your status as a scientist. I have a very high H-index. And so this paper here, Gates and Barabas, actually Barabasi, I don't know why. Okay. This is the HA index, the average citation H index. This is I don't know what this is exactly. This is reproducible science of science at scale, pi psi psi. So this is sort of a bibliometric analysis where you're analyzing publications, looking at the H-index. There's also this research assessment aspect, and then putting this into a network. And this is an area they call scientometrics. So this is a subset of meta sciences, scientometrics, basically the metrics of science. So this article, The Science of Science, or Sci-Sci, is a growing field encompassing diverse interdisciplinary research programs that study the process underlying science. The field has benefited greatly from access to massive digital databases containing the products of scientific discourse, including publications, journals, patents, books, conference proceedings, and grants. The subsequent proliferation of mathematical models and computational techniques for quantifying the dynamics of innovation and success in science has made it difficult to disentangle universal scientific processes from those dependent on specific databases, data processing decisions, field practices, etc. So what they're arguing is that there are a lot of techniques out there. How do you know if they're actually hitting on the sort of universal process that you're trying to uncover? Sometimes, depending on where you're looking in the literature, depending on the sort of analytical decisions you make and the type of measurement practices you have, you're not necessarily hitting that. So it's kind of like what we talked about before about how people have a debate, and sometimes they're in this bubble where they're in a certain field and their perspectives outside the field might be helpful, but sometimes not. It just depends on the question and how it's presented and how it's sort of, what's incorporated into it. And then, there's this idea that there's this universal answer that would be found if we had the perfect methods and the perfect approach, and which is not, that's an assumption. That's not necessarily the case. Here we present pi psi psi, a freely available and easily adaptable package for the analysis of large-scale bibliometric data. The pi psi psi package standardizes access to many of the most common data sets in sci-sci. So there are a bunch of data sets in the science of science, and provides efficient implementations of common and advanced analytical techniques. So this is a growing area. People have analyzed co-citation networks. They've analyzed, different databases with references in them. They've looked at meta-analysis and things like that. And then there's bibliometric data, which is basically like going through databases and mining different papers for their keywords and their citation rates and things like that. Jointly with the analysis of scientific processes, such bibliometric data are used to map the evolution of specific fields, evaluate scientific performance and eminence, and support government policy and funding decisions. But bibliometric data is distributed across diverse databases, each with their own criterion for inclusion, and varied processes to ensure the data's quality and accuracy. So in the field of bibliometrics, you have different databases you can use, and you have the same problem of which one do you use, which one has you the best, which is the most inclusive, that might give you the best answer, and which process is best to ensure data quality and accuracy. And so here we introduce PySci-Sci, an open source Python package for the analysis of large-scale bibliometric data. The PySci-Sci package provides one, standardized pre-processing and access to many of the most common data sets in Sci-Sci. So one of the ways you get to that standard of a universal answer is by having a standardized pipeline where you pre-process the data in a certain way that's always the same. If you use this over multiple studies, maybe over periods of time or something, and then access to many of these data sets. So you're not excluding any one data set that's important. 2 is an extensive library of quantitative measures fundamental to Sci-Sci. So this is where you can pick a measure, use it, and you don't have to think about like which method should I use and which one is the best for this. You have this library that kind of presents it as like these are the options for you, and then you can use it. 3 is advanced methods for mapping bibliometric networks. So when we have our citations, a co-citation graph is a network. So there are interactions between the citations. And then that's one way you can figure out some of these citations statistics, and also sort of the shape of a certain field. So I don't know if we've done these bibliometric network maps in previous meetings, but it's basically like a map of, say, like cognitive science. And you would have this network where you'd have different hubs around, like cognitive psychology or neuroscience or neuroimaging or, philosophy. And then you'd see how those things interact through that map. The PySci-Sci package is intended for researchers of Sci-Sci working from complete bibliometric databases or wish to integrate large-scale bibliometric data into other existing projects. By creating a standardized and adaptable programmatic base for the study of bibliometric data, we intend to help democratize Sci-Sci, so make it available to anyone. And then that's their goal. And so this is something that's including the most comprehensive collection of methods and data sources in scientometrics and bibliometrics. So there have been other approaches of this: bibliometrics, bibliotools, and Citan. And then 2 of the most popular bibliometric programs, VOS Viewer and CiteSpace, are designed to provide graphical network maps of science. Neither of these are open sourced or modifiable. So this is the thing that we were talking about yesterday in our GSOC meeting. This is with respect to the open source sustainability project. So this is something that Raj should look up after, I'll queue up the meeting to this point for him. That, like in the paper we did on open source sustainability and our approach, we kind of cite other groups. Other groups have done things similar, but not the same. So other groups have created tools where you can look at open source community involvement using different parameters, using different types of measures, like looking at different ways in which people contribute. But they don't have everything. They don't have the entirety of it. And so this is one thing when you think about tools, you want to think about how to place your tool in the world. Do you want to copy what someone else has done? Probably not. You might improve on what they've done, but it's likely not to be an improvement. It's likely to just be something else. And so people have to choose between the 2 tools. Here they're saying that, there are all these different tools that exist. They're basically complementing and extending capabilities of these, which is fine. But again, it doesn't give you that, so you're not finding a niche for yourself. And so, you have to compete with these platforms maybe. another route to this is having like an open source package as an alternative for things that are closed source. So VOS, viewer, and sitespace are closed source. They don't, you can't modify them. You can't access them openly. So open source and modifiable is a benefit for this. And so this is, I think, a less object lesson in how to sort of position these kind of projects, these kind of tools. I'm not a huge fan of making tools, but when you make tools, you should do them in a way that's, doesn't make them obsolete, or people can actually use them instead of like just kind of thinking it's more noise. So I want to see if they have any maps here. So they basically show how they do this. There are these data sources online, these different bibliometric databases, the Web of Science, Academic Graph, DBLP, Google Scholar. So they contain citations with, references, authorship, all this. Then you take those and you, extract the data on these different things like publications, journals, authors, affiliations, and so forth. Then there's this pre-processing where you remove things like self-citations or Windows citation counts or things like that. So there are ways you can normalize the data to make it a little bit more to your liking for your analysis. There are advanced metrics you can create with this. You can characterize the author, the journal, and then you have these networks of citations. So there are different types of networks like bipartite networks, temporal networks, graph embeddings that you can create, and then the co-authorship where you have, who's working with whom and how do those fit together. So one thing you can do is create graphs. This is the growth of science across databases. This shows basically the growth of science, and how do we quantify the growth of science? Well, we can look at database size of one of those databases as measured by the number of publications, journals, and authors. So if you have, this is the number of authors, for example. So these are just the different databases, these colors. I think it's World of Science. That's teal. This one here, Web of Science, I'm sorry. That's teal. MAG is dark green. DBLP is purple. DBLP is like a computer science database. And APS is in gold. That's not even shown on here, but you can see for the number of journals, APS shows up. And so you see the number of journals, the number of authors, and the number of publications. And so that shows you what you can do with the data. Of course, another thing you can do is build networks. I'm not sure if they show an actual network here. This is the network analysis. So they show here, okay, this is an example of a network where you have fields. You have computer science, you have other, economic, sociology. What you basically do is you build a network. You have this interaction, set of interactions. You put a matrix in place. You use a graph generation program to plot this topology. The topology doesn't have any spatial consequence other than, sometimes you'll identify your nodes, they're colored based on their category. Sometimes you can identify clusters of nodes. So like this is an economics cluster here. It's not, mutually exclusive. It's just kind of like here. There's computer science clustered here and so forth. The spatiality of this makes no difference. And so that's what it looks like. And this is one way you can assess interdisciplinarity. This is something I think, that's very important in sort of understanding cognitive science and the shape and structure of the field. So if we were to do this for like cognitive science, we would have like a bunch of cognitive science references. We'd analyze them. We'd like basically create this graph. And then we can say, what parts of cognitive science are the most active, or what parts of cognitive science fit together. So you probably get a cluster in psychology, some in neuroimaging, computer science, linguistics, philosophy, but you'd see those things would be in clusters and maybe not well connected to other areas. So this is one way to assess how different areas are connected. Computer science and economics are weakly connected. It's only a few links that are really connecting them. Computer science maybe has more affinity with other fields. But this is how you get at this. And it's still incomplete because you can extract global parameters from these network topologies, but they're not, you can't really say a lot more than like these global parameters. I mean, there are ways you can actually look at the local structure, but it's a problem with network analysis, and I'm not going to go into that much more today. But suffice it to say, there's been, of course, we've talked about in past meetings about how this is, if you're building a network from neuroimaging data, a brain network, that there are similar problems where it's hard to get at like certain mechanisms using a network analysis. In any case, this is a co-citation network. And so I think it's quite interesting for some of the things we've been talking about in Cognition Futures and in network science more generally. And so that's an example of Metascience bringing together like the science of science, analyzing scientific fields, and so forth. Do we have any comments on their questions?
Nope. Not for me. I might have to go soon also.
All right.
Mother's Day stuff soon.
Oh, yeah.
But I might try to listen. I don't know if you're going to do virtual papers or not. But I'll check it out.
Yeah.
Thanks, boys.
Okay. Well, I'm going to do one more thing today, and that's going to be this feature on causality in circles. So it might be interesting, but I'll cue it up in the recording for you as well. So this is maybe a more general thing we can talk about later. But this is about causality. This is actually inspired by a toot, which is the equivalent of a tweet on Mastodon from Johann John. And he is talking about, sometimes I think radical claims about causality arise from confusing a spatialized diagram with a temporal sequence. So this is kind of what we were talking about with networks, but also, with the spatiality, that there's no distinct spatiality, like there's no right and left. In network science, you'll often plot things based on like force layouts and things like that, and the spatiality isn't implicit, or it's implicit. It's there, but it's not really laid out explicitly. What Johann's saying is that in causality, where you have the relationship between variables, you have this aspect of people thinking that, say, A causes B and B causes A is the way, it's circular because you have to put B over here and A over here. So there's this spatiality that's implied. It's actually a temporal sequence. So like A causes B, A happens first and then B happens later. And then that's just a consequence of time, not necessarily of space. They're maybe in the same location. They're just causing things like, in time. And then feedback is really kind of the interaction of B with A. So it's like a interactivity, or like, there's this co-influence as opposed to like the spatial cycle. And then phenomena that are part of the spatial structural loop are sometimes described as enabling circular causality. But I think this is just regular causality. So he works out some of the math down here. These are all equivalent. This is an equivalency sign. So it's like a equal sign with another line above it. So this circular path here is equivalent to this down here, where you have regular causality that's just interacting. That's equivalent to this sort of function where it's almost like a time series, where you have this C, T minus change in T leads to C, this function C, where C is this interaction between A and B. So that's the way he's thinking about this. And I actually looked in the literature to look for some more information about this. One thing, Maxim Roginski, who we've talked about in the meetings, he wrote this paper on the archive called Directed Information and Pearl's Causal Calculus. So Judea-Pearl, of course, is one of the big names in causality, and he's done a lot of work with directed acyclic graphs, which are basically like trees that, have a root at the top and then they go down and they work themselves through this sort of linear causality. And then basically what he's arguing here, and this, I'll just read the abstract. Probabilistic graphical models are a fundamental tool in statistics, machine learning, signal processing, and control. So a causal acyclic graph is so we've seen what a regular graph looks like, or one of the complex graphs that we saw. They're kind of like this, where they don't have any real. There's some directionality, but it's like there were a lot of interacting parts, so it might look like that. A causal diagram or a directed acyclic graph is where you have it's directed, so it's going downward. It's acyclic, which means it doesn't have cycles. So a cycle is where you would have like this element coming back up here. So you'd have a cycle. So this is like, you can think about this as like something originates here at A, it moves down to B, it goes down to C, so it's branching just like this, but then C goes back up to A. And that's what they call a cycle. So there's a cycle between A and A. This ABC cycle. Now you don't see this in directed acyclic graphs. So you have this directed acyclic and then graph, because it's a graph just like this. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. He says directed acyclic graphs. When such a model is defined on a directed acyclic graph, which is this probabilistic graphical model, one can assign a partial ordering to the events occurring in the corresponding stochastic system. Based on the work of Judea-Pearl and others, these DAG-based causal factorizations of joint probability measures, which is where you have a set of joint probabilities that occur, say, up in this node, and then they get factored downwards. So anything like, if there's something that happens with 100% probability here, it might be 30% here, 70% here, and then something can be like, has to take a part of that 30, so it would be like 10 and 20. So you're basically factoring the likelihood of something happening. And as you go down the tree, it gets like less and less likely until you go to a specific instance. So you can tell what class something belongs to by doing these factorizations. And it's linear, so you don't have to worry about interactions. And then so this mostly expository paper focuses on several connections between Pearl's formalism, and in particular his notion of intervention, and the information theoretic notions of causality and feedback, such as causal conditioning, directed stochastic kernels, and directed information. And so there are these ties to information theory that Maxim brings out here. It's really interesting. And then, of course, this has to do with causality and feedback. So, causality, of course, is where one thing affects another. Feedback is where you have the circular aspect to it. As an application, we show how conditional directed information can be used to develop an information theoretic version of Pearl's backdoor criterion for identifiability of causal effects from passive observations. This suggests that the backdoor criterion can be thought of as a causal analog of statistical sufficiency. So this is probably a bit over everyone's head here, but he's basically taking this idea of feedback and of linearity and kind of working it out into this set of, that you can actually use the methods of causality to understand this. So it's a little bit different from Johann's approach or Johann's idea, but I think it does tie into it. So I'm not going to go through the whole paper, but I think there's some interesting things here that we could revisit if people are interested. It kind of just goes through a lot of information theory, a lot of dynamical systems and diagrams and things like that. So, yeah. So in the interest of time, I won't get deeply into it. But keep that in mind, what he said about this. So the second paper is by David Vernon, who does a lot of stuff with, cognition and robots and things like that. Tom Zemke, who's in the embodiment area, and other co-authors. This is called Embodied Cognition and Circular Causality, on the role of constitutive autonomy and the reciprocal coupling of perception and action. So this is taking this aspect of causality and feedback, and whether it's circular or not, and putting it into the world of perception and action. So it's actually embodying with this problem, giving it more of a sort of a practical flavor. So perception and action, of course, we understand that, we can model that, we can actually demonstrate it. So it's not just boxes and arrows, it's this thing that we can see in the world. So the abstract, the reciprocal coupling of perception and action in cognitive agents has been firmly established. Perceptions guide action, but so too do actions influence what is perceived. So this is a take on sort of circular causality, where you have, perception, which is the sort of the, I guess your A, if you have a feedback loop. So you have A and B, of course, and you have the feedback between them. And so A is maybe the perception part, where you're getting information in. B is this processing, which produces action. This is perception. And then this is maybe like a sensory organ, and then the brain. So they're different things. I guess they're spatialized in that sense, but they're part of the same system. So you can think of it that way, but they will, they'll approach this from a more sort of embodied perspective. While much can be said about on the implications of this for the agent's external behavior, less attention has been paid to what it means for the internal bodily mechanisms, which underpin cognitive behavior. So this is, this feedback, this perception action loop is really focused on external behavior. You can identify the perception action loop by, if you measure the percept and you measure the sort of the movement or the behavior of the agent, then that gives you this sort of, okay, there's so much sensory input, there's so much output and behavior. We can see how these, how this feedback loop is providing feedback. Is there gain, is there lag, etc. There are these different terms you can use to understand what the effect of feedback is. So less attention has really been paid to what it means for the internal bodily mechanisms. So what's going on internally in the brain or in the physiology? In this article, we wish to redress this by reasserting that the relationship between cognition, perception, and action, which is, of course, now they're putting in cognition instead of just the perception and action loop. So in this case, your cognition is probably this B, because that's the internal thing that we're looking at. And, you can think of this in if you're thinking about another problem, this might not be cognition, this might be something else. This might be some sort of processing. And so, you can think of this problem not as just a perception action loop, but as perception, cognition, action in this sort of causal chain, or, sort of causal loop. So, you don't have to think about it as feedback. You can think about it in other ways. And so, all right, so it involves a constitutive element as well as a behavioral element, emphasizing that the reciprocal link between perception, action, and cognition merits a renewed focus on the system dynamics inherent in constitutive biological autonomy. So that's kind of what they're getting at with their model. It's this idea of autonomy. How does autonomy produced? And this is a little bit more than just a simple feedback loop now. This is a whole systems approach where you have this chain of events that are kind of circular. Our argument centers on the idea that cognition, perception, and action are all dependent on processes, focused primarily on the maintenance of the agent's autonomy. So this means that the agent has to produce behaviors based on sort of its environmental input, but also some sort of autonomous decision making. So it can't just be like an input-output, It can't be reflexive. It has to have this autonomous aspect. These processes have an inherently circular nature, self-organizing, self-producing, and self-maintaining. And our goal is to explore these processes and suggest how they can explain the reciprocity of perception and action. So this is interesting because they can bring up these different terms, and this is different from what, like an information theorist or maybe like, a person interested in causality is talking about, because these are different kind of higher order concepts, but these are all processes that have this kind of circular nature. So, again, we have like, self-organization, self-maintenance. Those things involve maybe this box being more complex and having more interactions between the pathways here. So this isn't just a tight feedback loop. They call this a first order feedback loop, where you have, basically this tight relationship between A and B, first order. What they're suggesting is that this is actually not first order feedback, but like a more sort of, higher order feedback, I guess. And that it's, that you have to produce something like self-organization for the purposes of producing autonomy. So self-maintenance and then autonomy. Okay. So autonomy is kind of hard to define what that looks like. Well, we know it when we see it. We know if there's an autonomous agent, maybe it's capable of making decisions on its own. You don't need to hold its hand all the time. Maybe it's capable of making movements on its own that it makes up out of whole cloth. It doesn't necessarily just have a reflexive aspect to it. So these are all things that need to be done in like, say, a robotic agent. And so this black box here gets broken down into pieces, and you just don't have this tight feedback loop anymore. You have this whole system of interacting elements. And so that's what they're getting at here. And so they want to just explain the reciprocity of perception and action, but not as that tight first order feedback loop. Specifically, we argue that the reciprocal coupling is founded primarily on their endogenous roles and the constitutive autonomy of the agent and an associated circular causality of global and local processes of self-regulation. So in other words, a lot of these parts that we are missing in that diagram, rather than being a neutral sensory motor contingency derived from exogenous behavior. So this mutual sensory motor contingency would just simply be this very simple first order feedback loop with no detail. And so that's not what they're arguing. That's just like one part of it. There's much more to it. So you see, when you put it in this context of function, it's quite a bit different in terms of thinking about this. Furthermore, the coupling occurs first and foremost via the internal milieu, which is something that physiologists traditionally refer to as the sort of the grist for homeostasis, the sort of the internal environment that they can characterize the state of, and then use that to regulate it, self-regulate, be self-regulating. And it requires a sort of more than just this tight first order feedback. People often draw this sort of these boxes and arrows, but really it's a complex system of a lot of different interacting variables. Finally, we consider how homeostasis and the related concept of allostasis contribute to the circular self-regulation. So we talk a lot about the allostatic drive and things like that, homeostasis. This might be a good paper to revisit for this because it kind of gets into these issues with respect to feedback and cognition in agents sort of generally, but I think we could probably use this. This has a lot of citations to Varela, so yeah, we'll definitely have to revisit this paper. And then the last paper for this section is it's actually a biology philosophy paper by Kevin Lalonde, Olding Smee, and co-authors. These are people who've done a lot of work on niche construction as a concept. This paper is more on how and why, cause and effect in biology revisited. So this is focusing on biology. This is focusing on cause and effect in this field of biology. This is different than cognition, but it's also different than the boxes and arrows models that we saw for information theory and for causality, statistical causality. In 1961, Ernst Mayr, who was a famous evolutionary biologist, published a highly influential article on the nature of causation in biology, in which he distinguished between proximate and ultimate causes. So Mayr argued that the proximate causes are physiological factors, and ultimate causes, natural selection, address distinct how and why questions, and were not competing alternatives. So this is interesting because the physiological factors, or the proximate causes, are really localized to one generation. So it's usually one of these systems, one of these first order feedback systems operating perception and action over the lifetime of the organism. On the other hand, you have ultimate causes. So you have natural selection. So what that means is that in ultimate causation, you would have this kind of first order feedback loop, and maybe you'd have a bunch of different alternative first order feedback loops configured in different ways. And natural selection would select one over others. So there'd be one configuration that would survive, that would be, the most suitable for the organism. So that's the one that would kind of persist over generations. So as the system is reproduced, that feedback loop would be in place. So there's a difference, though, in the causality there, that there's this causality that's local, and then there's this meta-causality that changes how those causal relations occur over time. So there's this proximate and ultimate causality. So when we look at an organism now, we see different adaptations. Are those adaptations a product of its life cycle, or is it the product of natural selection? So you see it persist over generations, or is it something that it's encountering in its local environment? So this is a distinction that retains explanatory value. However, this sort of framework led to the belief that ontogenetic or developmental processes were irrelevant to evolutionary questions. So there's been this issue of, there are changes in development that are important that we don't capture in this idea. Here we expand on our earlier argument that Mayr's dichotomous formulation has now run its useful course, that evolutionary biology would be better served by a concept of reciprocal causation, in which causation is perceived to cycle through biological systems recursively. We further suggest that a newer evolutionary synthesis is unlikely to emerge without this change in thinking about causation. So this gets into this debate about the extended synthesis and evo-devo and things like that. But the thing I wanted to point to in this paper is that there's this aspect of causation, meta-causation, and how that affects the system that we see before us, that we observe in one observation. Is it the product of long-term causality, or is it the product of local causality, or is it something else? Is it this aspect of reciprocal causation? And so I don't know if they have any good figures here for their idea. Let's see if they do, because I think it would be important to see the distinction. I'm not sure, but yeah. See, papers like this always need to have some good figures, but I'm not sure if that's what we're going to get. In any case, they get into things like niche construction and evo-devo. They talk about teleology, which is, of course, the thing that you're going to get into when you get into causality. And, there's some problems with talking about teleology in biology because it makes some assumptions that maybe aren't warranted. But there is this different idea of causality and how it works, and the kinds of things that we should think about. So this reciprocal causation as a suitable framework is, something. It's another variation on this. So I don't really have answers here beyond what I've talked about. Okay, Vrushali had to leave. Thank you, Vrushali, for attending. But I think it's all food for thought, and I think it's very interesting that people have so many diverse views of causality and feedback and reciprocal causality, and we've been that actually there was the tweet by Maxim Roginski that we talked about earlier. I don't know if it's in the Notion, but he talked about we should shut down all loose metaphors about feedback until we talk about control theory, which is good. But I mean, we also have to think that there are these other possibilities for what a feedback loop is.
That's partly why I'm really excited about, like, I'm realizing part of what's great about the Cognition Futures project is not just, hey, we're developing a theory, but some of the work we're doing, I think, is really important work for, quote unquote, the cognitive science project in general, like modeling the glossaries. I'm sure other people have done that,
yeah.
but trying to release some public data for, like, here's our descriptive versus our prescriptive glossary, and like making some like overt connection. It's kind of like a data management. It's sort of like managing data, I suppose, or like managing philosophical data. That's actually an exciting way to think about it. I haven't thought about it for overtly, but that's what we're trying to do. I think that will help some of the things we want to do in like the product sense. But yeah, to go back to what you said, I missed some of the last paper, but it's a good set of papers, and I think I agree with what you said about, like, there's a lot going on here, and yeah. So I want to put all the papers into Notion. But,
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think in the last paper, it kind of fits into the discussion in the way when they say reciprocal causality, they really mean this first order feedback, and they're not thinking necessarily in the systems view or in the engineering view or even in the cognitive science view, because they're evolutionary biologists. And so what they say is reciprocal causality is basically this first order feedback loop. But then the other papers talk about this as being maybe insufficient. So you have these cycles in these graphs, which are basically like these feedback loops. Sometimes these are not like a full description of the system. Sometimes it's just like we have these boxes as stand-ins for other things inside. And then these arrows are just like the, flow from one thing to another. So you maybe have a system here where it's like a sensory organ and there's all sorts of stuff in there. And then it gives you an output that goes to B, but there's all sorts of stuff in there. And then there's an arrow here, and this isn't necessarily a feedback loop at this point. It's just a bunch of things that kind of have this sort of reciprocal causality, that there's one thing affects another, and then it comes back to affect that same thing that generated part of that signal. So it's going back around. And so, I mean, the lesson here too is that people think about this in different ways, and they're sort of convergent. And maybe it's our job to get that convergence and figure out what it is.
Yes to all that stuff. I'm gonna have to step out, but I'm gonna review some of this and follow up on things. But good stuff.
Right.
Take care, everybody.
Take care. Have a good week.
You too.
Bye.
Here, Jason.
Bye. Oh, Morgan, did you want to say anything?
No, just the extended synthesis work is very interesting, and there's a lot to it, and it's quite nuanced, and as you said, in terms of these kind of discussions of teleology.
Yeah.
But I did drop in an additional paper. I think in I forget now exactly. Maybe in bioevolution. But,
okay.
But a multi-omics paper of evolution of acquired traits
Okay.
in human beings. So just that same kind of what instances of Lamarckianism that we can
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll have to take a look at that. I don't know if I found the right one, but it's in the bioevolution channel. So
Yeah. I had wanted to talk to Amanda about the cell-free. I pointed to the lecture at the Innovative Genomics Institute that was talking about the evolution of single membranes, cellular membranes.
Oh yeah.
And she dropped a link of the cellular membranes are not necessary. Like zero. How about zero cellular membranes? And the text she pointed to, it's an interesting author who's, I think, actually a bioengineer by training, but was talking a lot about he's talking a lot about structured water, and I think the kind of modern stuff would be like hydrogels and things like that. Like what is the physics of the interior of the cell? Is it just that, and how different is the physics in the interior of the cell due to the membrane and the things like the resting potential and things like that.
Okay, so it's like a neuroscience type thing, or like a.
I would definitely say more like a molecular biology of the cell.
Yeah.
And these ideas that the physics of the the solution in the cell is perhaps a little bit different than we're imagining. And I've seen some other papers on that in terms of trying to get at the actual physical properties of the water in the interior of the cell, like how much, and it really speaks to how you're going to do like cell transport modeling in general, right? Like how are things getting around between organelles and things like that, like. But again, like super fascinating discussions that been trying to follow, Michael Evans appeared on a podcast together with Nick Lane, who's, kind of origin of life, cellular metabolism, like a straight up biochemist, right? But both of them were speaking about non-neuronal intelligence.
Okay, yeah.
Right. And because again, part of Dennis Noble's point is that as a physiologist, is that it is really like, are we sure we know what evolution is operating on? Right. And I think doing a very good job of giving a nuanced discussion of what that is, right? He's not trying to be revolutionary. He's in his mind, he's really trying to get it, in his mind, he's trying to get at Darwin's original kind of mindset, or Darwin's original thinking about this, because he wants to say Darwin was very appreciative of Lamarck's work.
Yeah.
And that Meyer, who you mentioned, the kind of the 1960s evolutionary biologist, had, this is one of Dennis Noble's things where he's like, Meyer saw that Darwin talks about Lamarckian evolution like multiple times in Origin of the Species, and Nick Lane gets as a metabolic or as someone who studies metabolism, it's really hard to not think about physiology, right? It's like, it is. It's and I will say that as when I was studying biochemistry, I do I definitely had an epiphany with metabolism, and I've actually got a try and find this one textbook. That was very influential for me. But yeah, I started checking out the link that Amanda had sent, but I think there's some good things there. That particular author seems to also have some ideas that like his water ideas influence his climate science, and I would say perhaps in a not productive way.
Yeah.
But anyway, just somewhat also along those lines, Mike Levin had another one of his podcasts where he was speaking with both Richard Watson and Chris Fields, right? So the Chris Fields is doing the physics course with Active Inference Institute.
Yeah.
What did he call it? It's like physics of information.
Yeah, physics of information, I think, theory.
Yeah. But,
information processing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Again, just a great discussion with those three in terms of their kind of shared interests. And but the interesting thing being that they're all coming from such different perspectives, right?
Yeah.
So and again, and it's awesome that Michael Levin's perspective is as a computer scientist.
Yeah.
Always interesting, and I will continue following up on these papers that you bring up. Really good stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Any thoughts on the Metascience stuff?
I was excited by it, and then totally got distracted this week and couldn't. It's one of those things about a virtual meeting. It's like I want all the virtual meetings to be. I want all meetings to have a virtual component.
Yeah.
But then it is also easy to then get distracted and something else come up, and when you take the time to physically go somewhere, you stay focused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
but I'm hoping that I can still check out this. And hopefully they have those recorded and be able to check out all those talks.
Yeah.
Obviously, great stuff there, and I was hoping to. And Melanie Mitchell also posted the videos from I think a meeting she had April 24th, which seemed to focus a little bit on something she's spoken about already, but I want to see the other speakers, but meaning in large language models.
Oh yeah,
seem to be part of it. Maybe there's been too much on that already, and we need to actually just work with them for a while.
Yeah.
But it has been it's been interesting to follow the Steve Pendokius. Sorry.
Bianchowski or something.
But the Berkeley professor who had the interesting paper on large language models.
Oh yeah.
Following the discussion that they had with him at Active Inference Institute.
Oh yeah. And
how his paper was posted on Lingbuzz, which is it's like a archive for linguistics papers.
Okay.
And it's just been interesting to see the last 6 months. They have kind of like a leaderboard on the side of the Lingbuzz page or site, and you can see that just large language models and kind of examining their structure and outputs and things like that has like completely taken over the leaderboard in terms of like this is the buzz right now.
Yeah.
And also the plethora of papers from psychologists and cognitive scientists where they're just taking the kinds of studies that they would do with humans, and then they're they're using the large language models, right?
Yeah.
And it is interesting. I think it's a great topic to talk about. Like, what does that mean? It seems very Bratenberg, in a just in a linguistic fashion. Right, because it's like we know these aren't conscious. We know they're not, sentient. This is, but they are producing all these complex behaviors in terms of, I've seen like theory of mind papers, all sorts of cognitive tasks, all sorts of strange linguistic tasks that only linguists fully understand. And consistently, they're getting human-like responses. I mean, the psychiatric ones are kind of the funniest because the measures they get are like, we're showing large language models are showing signs of anxiety.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's obvious that we will be studying these from now on and into the future.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So it's been also good, or it's been great to see the people who've been focused on I wonder at what point Neuromatch will have a new track for like large language model transformer, because it just because it's generating such interesting interesting behavior.
Yeah, I don't know if they're going to add that. Well, they have the deep learning course, so they may add that this year. I'd imagine that.
Yeah. I mean, I think at some point it really brings up, like because they have a deep learning and a computational neuroscience, right?
Right.
It's like they've seen before that there are other specialty areas,
Right.
like those are distinct,
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, sure, this is coming from deep learning, but in terms of understanding, the language processing and in particular, all of the, this isn't computational neuroscience, right? This is definitely more like, it's more like computational psychology, right?
Yeah.
Like we'll get there at some point. Maybe in like 5 years, Neuromatch will have a new track. But it'll be interesting.
Yeah.
And just for those interested, I think the Andre Karpathy's been doing some really great educational stuff in terms of, like. It would seem to me like this would be the basis of a Neuromatch track if there was one.
Yeah.
So he's been doing these great videos, of like kind of 2 to 3 hour length, where he's coding up from scratch NLP models. The basic models. So it's kind of doing toy problems, but to make it the clearest educational explanation experience.
Yeah.
And
I think it's great. Well, yeah.
It's great stuff. It's really interesting stuff to follow, and it's been distracting from all the the organoid work is obviously progressing at super fast pace, and So it's eclipsing a lot of the biological work that's going on too, which I need to get back to. But.
Yeah, well, we can talk about that. Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for that update. That's great.
Oh, definitely good stuff. Good stuff.
Yeah, good stuff. All right. Well, have a good week.
All right, you too.
You
Take
too.
care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.